Everyone, this is Grockit's OGTV, where we go through the official guide of the GMAT page by page, question by question, giving you not only the answers, which are in the book, but the explanations, and we show our work so you can see it all live, or at least recorded in some cases. So, my name's Jim Jacobson, and we are now on page 27 in the 12th edition of the official guide, like it says at the bottom of the screen, and we are starting with the reading comprehension section in the diagnostic at the beginning. The format's going to be a little bit different on this one, so we're page 27, question 1. In this one, I do want to give you enough time to read the passage to yourself as we go, so you can fully comprehend the passage by the time we get to the actual questions. So there will be some moments of more or less silence while you can read. I'll also be reading and taking some notes on the screen. Note taking is optional, of course, but I find that taking some minimal notes actually helps me keep on track. It keeps me from going too far into the passage with, in the event that I space out or something. When I get to the end of the paragraph, if I don't understand what I just read, I can go back and reread it because I take notes at the end of each paragraph. So, without further ado, we may as well start. So again, we're on page 27, reading comprehension. I'll give us about 3 or 4 minutes to read the passage, and then we'll move through the questions. Okay, let's start looking at the questions. Hopefully you had a chance to read and comprehend the passage as well as possible. Do note that the passage will always be there for you. You don't have to rely on your notes, and in fact, in many cases, you may never refer back to them. A lot of the goodness of taking the notes is in the way that it helps you focus on the passage while you're reading it. You may well end up referring back to your notes, but don't assume that that's what's going to happen. Even though the passage, and again, the passage will always be there on the left-hand side of the screen on the real GMAT. So question number 1, which of the following best describes the purpose of the sentence in lines 10 to 15? So when they give us something like a line number, one of the first things we should do is go back and reread that actual sentence, because we're expected to know something about the purpose of the sentence. It's usually no, it is a good idea every time to read a little bit before and a little bit after to make sure that you remember the context of that sentence. So the sentence before says, Marquardt and McGann found that heavily advertised products did indeed rank high on certain measures of product quality. Then we have our sentence. Because large advertising expenditures represent a significant investment on the part of a manufacturer, only companies that expect to recoup these costs in the long run through consumers' repeat purchases of the product can afford to spend such amounts. Now, in this case, the next sentence is the beginning of the next paragraph. So context-wise, we know there's a sense shift after our sentence, and it's less important that we read it. So that particular sentence then was an expansion, it looks like, on the idea of the studies, or of the particular study by Marquardt and McGann. But so we're going to look for something like that in the answer choices. So we'll take a look at them one by one. A, to show that economic signaling theory fails to explain a finding. Well, really, there's definitely nothing like that in our particular sentence. There's no finding that has been failed, that anything has failed to explain. So we can get rid of choice A. Choice B, to introduce a distinction not accounted for by economic signaling theory. So that is something that happened in the passage, and this is one of the classic ways that they produce wrong answer choices on the GMAT, is to give you something else that did happen in the passage but not in the part that you're interested in, or in the case of main idea 1, something that happened but was not the main idea. So in this case, that's something that happens in paragraph 2. We're interested in a sentence that happens in paragraph 1, so it's not going to be choice B. Choice C, to account for an exception to a generalization suggested by Marquardt and McGann. There is no exception mentioned, and in fact this was an expansion or an explanation of what their study was, so this is the opposite of what we're after. Choice D, to explain why Marquardt and McGann's research was conducted. There's really no explanation in the passage at all as to why they did their study. Studies are generally done to explore the validity of theories, but that's beyond the scope of this actual passage, so it's not choice D. Now, process of elimination has gotten us to choice E, and if you're pressed for time, you could just choose E and move on to the next one. Again, especially if you're at the end of the exam and you're at that point where all of a sudden you realize you have to guess on the remaining ones. Hopefully it doesn't come to that, but if it does, here you could simply say, well, it must be choice E, I'm going to choose it and move on. In every other instance, though, it is absolutely worth your time to read it. Even though you've eliminated the other ones, choice E may turn out to be so wrong that that you have to reevaluate your understanding of the question. So choice E, to offer an explanation for an observation reported by Marquardt and McGann. And this is exactly what happened. They noticed that at some point advertising did affect consumer perception, and then this is the explanation for it. So it is clearly choice E for question 1. Since it's reading comprehension and we get several questions on each passage, we can leave our notes up and just redo our answer choices here on the side. So question 2, the primary purpose of the passage is to. So primary purpose, of course, that's the main idea of the passage. Words like primary, main, central, those are terms that are used to describe the main idea. Trap answers will often be details from the passage, that things that you do remember reading, but are not in fact the main idea. Also, there will be sometimes things that use words and ideas. specific phrases from the passage, but completely misrepresent what the main idea is. It is a good idea, a good solid strategy to have by the time you've finished every passage, have a rough idea of whether the author has explained something or is trying to convince you of something. It's a pretty important distinction, and it allows you to eliminate wrong answer choices, often on the basis of the first word alone. So, anyway, the primary purpose of the passage is to, so we're looking for something that captures this, and in our sense is the author isn't trying to convince us that one theory is better than another or that one set of evidence is more convincing than another. It's really more of an explanation. So choices that involve persuasion are less likely to be correct because that's not our sense of the passage. It's not my sense of the passage anyway. So choice A. Present findings that contradict one explanation for the effects of a particular advertising practice. It's sort of tempting at first because, of course, the second paragraph does provide it's not so much a contradiction as a limit. It says that this is kind of a spectrum or a continuum of consumer perception relative to the amount of advertising. And so there is no actual contradiction in the passage, and as such, we can pretty easily eliminate choice A, even though there is a shift or an opposition in the second paragraph. Choice B, argue. Well, so even just on the basis of the first word, argue sounds like the author is trying to convince us of something, and that's really not what we've seen, but we do need to read the whole thing to be sure. Argue that theoretical explanations about the effects of a particular advertising practice are of limited value without empirical evidence. Empirical means data-driven, and so the whole passage is about actual empirical studies that have been done. Both paragraphs have cite studies, so there's actually, how many studies? At least 4 studies mentioned in the paragraph, empirical studies. So choice B clearly cannot be correct, both from the basis of the verb and from the fact that it's talking about empirical evidence not really being a factor. Choice C, discuss how and why particular advertising practices may affect consumers' perceptions. So that sounds promising. We do want to be careful, though. We can imagine that this is towards the beginning of the test where we have plenty of time. We'll put a little arrow next to choice C and read on to read the rest of them, just to make sure that something better isn't there. So choice D, contrast the research methods used in 2 different studies of a particular advertising practice. Well, so if you're not reading carefully, this may look tempting because there is a contrast between 2 different sets of studies, the Marquardt-McGann and then the 3 in the second paragraph. However, we're not actually contrasting the studies or the results of the studies. We are in this answer choice. This one is talking about the research methods, how they go about doing their research. That has no place in this passage. So this answer choice might tempt you if you weren't reading very carefully, or might tempt someone else, the person next to you taking the GMAT. But you do need to be careful when they introduce additional words and ideas in the answer choices that aren't in the passage. That's something to be very suspicious of. No research methods, no choice D. Choice E, explain why a finding about consumer responses to a particular advertising practice was unexpected. So up until the last word, there's really nothing wrong with choice E, but choice E, the last word does just ruin it. There's nothing unexpected about the studies in the second paragraph here. They are additional information, a refinement of the theory expressed in the first paragraph, but there's nothing in the passage that suggests that this was a surprise or that this was unexpected. So choice E, reading all the way to the end, gets us to eliminate it. Choice C, which looked attractive to us originally, stays attractive. We select it and get it correct. Okay. Oh, I forgot to change the question number. Shame on me. All right, we're moving on to question number 3. So Kermani's research, as described in the passage, suggests which of the following regarding consumers' expectations about the quality of advertised products. So the question stem itself suggests to us that what we're dealing with is some kind of inference because it uses the word suggests rather than states. So what we're going to be looking for is something that is not necessarily explicitly stated outright, but is certainly that must be true based on the passage, if we accept the passage as true, which we have to. Okay. So consumers' expectations about the quality of advertised products, Kermani's research is in the second paragraph. Those are those 3 studies that we have here in our second paragraph thing right here. Didn't write down the people's names in the notes, but we remember that that's where that one was. So we need something about those studies, which were about the limits, that at some point too much spending erodes consumer confidence, or the thing about color and black and white in print advertisement. Those are the studies covered in that paragraph. So choice A. Those expectations are likely to be highest if a manufacturer runs both black and white and color advertisements for the same product. There's nothing in the passage that talks about both of them being run at the same time, simply what happens, what the difference is when one is run versus the other. And there's not enough information for us to infer what would happen if both were run at the same time, so it can't be choice A. Choice B. Those expectations can be shaped by the presence of color in an advertisement, as well as by the frequency with which an advertisement appears. So this is really tempting. The second part of this answer choice tells us, basically it's a restatement of the economic signaling theory, that the more the advertisement appears, that affects consumers' perception of quality. The first part of the answer choice specifically mentions the presence of color as opposed to to a black and white print advertisement, and that does sound a lot like what we saw in paragraph 2. So we're just going to kind of circle that one, draw an arrow next to it, so we know we're not done. Choice C. Those expectations are usually high for frequently advertised new brands, but not for frequently advertised familiar brands. So this introduces an interesting distinction between brands that are new to somebody versus ones that are familiar to somebody. Let's flip back a page just to refresh ourselves regarding what this is actually talking about. So actually in line, the first sentence really, according to economic signaling theory, consumers may perceive the frequency with which an unfamiliar brand is advertised as a cue that the brand is of high quality. The key element here is the phrase unfamiliar brand. All new brands will be unfamiliar to people, but not all unfamiliar brands are new. And so these studies, and economic signaling theory in particular, deals specifically with the broader category of brands that are unfamiliar. Choice C gives us what's basically a false contrast for the purposes of our passage here. There is no contrast in the passage between unfamiliar brands and new brands, and so to make this distinction is far outside the scope of the passage. Outside of scope. So we can get rid of choice C. Choice D. Those expectations are likely to be higher for products whose black and white advertisements are often repeated than for those whose color advertisements are less often repeated. So this is another one where there's a distinction in the answer choice that's not actually present in the passage. We do find out that the tipping point where consumers start to have less confidence in a product as advertising increases. This happens sooner with color versus black and white, but expectations about quality regarding black and white advertisements that are often repeated versus those that are less often repeated, without actual quantitative numbers here compared to the numbers in the actual study, none of which were given, this statement is impossible to support. So we would actually need to know the actual numbers from the passage and the actual frequency numbers here to make any sort of determination about whether this is something that Kermani's research suggests. The passage alone certainly does not. Get rid of choice D. Also outside of scope. Those expectations, this is choice E, those expectations are less definitively shaped by the manufacturer's advertisements than by information that the consumers gather from other sources. So other sources completely outside the scope of the original passage. So the original answer choice that appeared tempting to us, choice B, must be the correct one. We can move on to the next question. Same passage still. Okay. So Kirmani's third study, as described in the passage, suggests which of the following conclusions about a black and white advertisement. So this is a much finer point here. And again, this is also a Kirmani's third study suggests. So we're making an inference here, but something about something that must be true based on what the passage says, but is not stated word for word what we have in the answer choice. So it can be repeated more frequently. This is choice A. It can be repeated more frequently than a comparable color advertisement could before consumers begin to suspect low manufacturer confidence in the quality of the advertised product. So that's actually more or less a restatement of what the study said. We had it said that use of color affected consumer perception of brand quality, and the point at which repetition, this is line 30, the point at which repetition of an advertisement is perceived as excessive comes sooner for a color advertisement than for a black and white advertisement. So the choice A is actually the inverse of what we just had in the passage, that the black and white advertisement can be run for longer than the color one can be before consumer confidence starts to decline. So choice A sounds good. Arrow next to it because we're not sure yet. Let's take a look at the other answer choices. Choice B, it will have the greatest impact on consumers' perceptions of the quality of the advertised product if it appears during periods when a color version of the same advertisement is also being used. As with the last question, and I guess we've been done a favor here by the GMAT, every once in a while, one question will force you to look at a section of the passage that will provide you with an answer for something that comes later. In this particular case, there's nothing in the passage about the two being run at the same time. We had a similar answer choice from the previous one. It's still not right. It's not in the passage. Choice B is out. Choice C, it will attract more... Oh, sorry, this is question 4. Choice C, it will attract more attention from readers of the print publication in which it appears if it is used only a few times. So this is also somewhat tempting because it does say that there's a frequency issue that, you know, once it reaches a certain point, consumer confidence is eroded. However, there's nothing that says that the attention that the consumer pays to it is actually on some kind of sliding scale, only that at a certain point consumer confidence starts to decline. So we don't actually know about that, the building up to that tipping point. There's no information about the passage about that. So choice C is a little bit less tempting. Let's take a look at D. It may be perceived by some consumers as more expensive than a comparable color advertisement. This is 180 degrees opposite what the passage says. And this is an occasional wrong answer choice on the GMAT, but it relies on some people confusing some issues and perhaps not reading so carefully. However, it's still totally wrong. Choice E, it is likely to be perceived by consumers as a sign of higher manufacturer confidence in the quality of the advertised product than a comparable color advertisement would be. This is actually contrary to the whole idea of economic signaling theory. Remember, from the first paragraph, we find out that this is based on the consumer notion that the manufacturer could not sustain an expensive advertising campaign without expecting to make that money back from repeated purchases of the product. So only when the basis of economic signaling theory is that money spent on advertisement, whether it's color print advertisement or advertising on television or whatever, that's a sign of manufacturer confidence up to a point. So A black and white advertisement absolutely would not be taken as a sign of higher manufacturer confidence. If anything, a color one would, up to the point where it's deemed excessive by the consumer. So definitely not choice C. So we're left with A and C. Choice C kind of goes beyond the scope of the passage, talking about the build up to the tipping point, suggesting that it's a continuum of increasing consumer confidence. That may be true, but it's not in the scope of the passage, leaving us with choice A, that black and white advertisements can be repeated more often. Question number 5. The passage suggests that Kirmani would be most likely to agree with which of the following statements about consumers' perceptions of the relationship between the frequency with which a product is advertised and the product's quality. So Kirmani's research, again, is in the second of our 2 paragraphs, so we know more or less where we're going to have to go if we aren't sure. And this one is kind of the question stem doesn't give us a lot of information to go on in terms of prediction, so we really do just need to tackle the answer choices. Choice A. Consumers' perceptions about the frequency with which an advertisement appears are their primary consideration when evaluating an advertisement's claims about product quality. There's nothing in the passage that talks about it being the consumer's primary consideration, only that this has an effect based on the frequency of the advertisement. So again, watch out for words and terms and ideas that refine the answer choice further than the passage actually allows you to do. We don't actually find out about consumers' primary concerns, just that this is a factor, so it can't be choice A. Choice B, because most consumers do not notice the frequency of advertisement, it has little impact on most consumers' expectations regarding product quality. So choice B is another one of these reverse ones. Crazy alternate universe where the passage is about something completely opposite what it actually is. Choice B actually says, the passage actually says that this is exactly not true, that consumers do pay attention and the frequency affects perception of quality. So definitely not choice B. Choice C. Consumers perceive frequency of advertisement as a signal about product quality only when the advertisement is for a product that is newly on the market. This is another one where some of our previous work has helped us out. One of the previous answer choices made a false distinction between, or a non-useful distinction between products that are new and products that are unfamiliar. The passage itself does only talk about products that are unfamiliar, not ones that are new. So choice C provides a distinction that allows us to eliminate it. Thank you, choice C. Choice D, the frequency of advertisement is not always perceived by customers to indicate that manufacturers are highly confident about their product's quality. So that's kind of a backwards way of saying that the frequency of advertisement can indicate that manufacturers are not confident. Because what it says is it doesn't always indicate that they are confident, which means that some of the time frequency is perceived to indicate that manufacturers are not confident, which is the whole point of this economic signaling theory. So we definitely like choice D. That's a good one. Choice E, consumers who try a new product that has been frequently advertised are likely to perceive the advertisement's frequency as having been an accurate indicator of the product's quality. So again, we once again have this new product versus familiar products. On that basis alone, we can cross this one off. But also, we don't actually have information in the passage about what happens once people try the actual product. This is all about perceptions of quality, specifically relative to advertising. It does not enter into the passage at all whether the customers actually try the passage and then look back at the advertisement and decide what they think about that. This is purely perception of quality based on advertisement. So for 2 reasons, choice E is easily eliminatable, leaving us with choice D as the correct answer. Okay, we'll move on to the next one. As before, so we're on page 29 now. Oh dear, I didn't change the page. Sorry about that. Let's get rid of the notes on the previous passage. So now passage on page 29, and we will be starting with question 6. Again, as before, I'll give you a few minutes to read the passage. I will take notes on it as we go, and we will go from there. So start reading. Okay, so let's start tackling those questions. Ideally, our comprehension of the passage allows us to move through the questions much more quickly. Keep in mind that reading comprehension passages always have this large initial time investment that if you do well and understand the passage well the first time, you should be able to move through most of the questions quickly, bringing your average right back down to where it needs to be for the average, the under 2 minutes per question for the whole verbal section of the GMAT. So number 6, the main purpose of the passage is to. So main purpose, of course, is asking us for the main idea. We need something that captures the whole passage, not just the details in it. And again, with main purpose, a lot of times we can eliminate answer choices based on the verb used, depending on whether the author was actually trying to persuade us of something or just explain. In this particular case, the author basically seems to be trying to convince us that this guy Searle is wrong about brains and thinking versus the computers. But again, to be sure, we always want to read the whole answer choice. So choice A, propose an experiment. Well, there is this kind of experiment of a mechanical stomach in the third paragraph, but really that's not the whole point of the passage, and it's really he or she is not actively proposing that they make this mechanical stomach, just that it would be something that would prove a point. So it's not choice A. Choice B, analyze a function. Well, functions of brains and stomachs are certainly discussed in the passage, but this really is not the point of the passage. It's actually about arguing, if anything, towards a theory of the mind, so rather than a specific function. We can get rid of choice B. Choice C, refute an argument. So refute means to prove wrong. So this actually sounds a lot like what the author is doing. The author is trying to refute this argument of this Searle person. So we will say that we like C. Choice D, explain a contradiction. There's not really a contradiction, except perhaps in Searle's thinking, but that's not the whole point of the passage. It's just something that happens along the way. Get rid of that guy. Choice E, simulate a process. Now, simulation actually does play a prominent role in the passage. In fact, it's kind of the main thrust of the author's argument against Searle. However, it's not the overall argument against Searle, just a part of that argument, and as such cannot be the main idea. Choice C then, the one with the smiley face, is our correct answer. Okay, so still on page 29, question number 7. Which of the following is most consistent with Searle's reasoning as presented in the passage? So here's one that something being consistent with something else. We're not looking for something that's actually stated. This is another way of expressing an inference question. So we're looking for something that's consistent with what's there, something that's logically dependent on what's there, but is not actually present. And there's no prediction that we can make because Searle's reasoning appears actually in all 3 paragraphs. So we're going to have to just read the answer choices. We can't do any thinking in advance. Choice A, meaning and content cannot be reduced to algorithms. Well, that actually sounds a lot like what we get in lines 6 through 9. We just got introduced to John R. Searle, a philosopher who argues that since computers simply follow algorithms, they cannot deal with important aspects of human thought, such as meaning and content. So that is very consistent with his thinking, so we will make that a very happy face, sort of a crooked, very happy face. Choice B, the process of digestion can be simulated mechanically, but not on a computer. So this represents Searle's perhaps objection to a computer simulation of a stomach digesting, but it's not consistent with his reasoning per se. Also, the author, him or herself, even goes on to expand the computer simulation of the stomach to an actual mechanical one. So in some ways, it's likely that both the author and Searle would disagree with choice B. Choice C, simulated thoughts and real thoughts are essentially similar because they are composed primarily of information. This is very much an argument, a reasoning throughout the passage, but it's the author's, not Searle's. So if you're not reading carefully, this one might be attractive because choice C totally happens in the passage, just not for this particular question. Choice D, a computer can use causal powers similar to those of the human brain when processing information. So causal powers do get mentioned. We find them. Oh, yeah, line 12. People have something Searle obscurely calls the causal powers of the brain. So here, we're actually finding out that causal powers are a term apparently made up by Searle or used in a mysterious way by Searle to describe what brains can do and what computers can't do. So it cannot be that computers could use them, or it certainly wouldn't be his argument that they could. We're only left with choice E then. Computer simulations of the world can achieve the complexity of the brain's representations of the world. So this is one of those classic cases of terms and ideas being introduced in the answer choice that are simply not present in the passage. If you subtract the phrase "of the world," we would actually have something approaching perhaps the author's argument. So computer simulations can achieve the complexity of the brain's representations. The author might agree with that. Searle certainly would not. But once you add in computer simulations of the world, we have nothing about the world in our answer choice. Or in our passage. We do actually find out that the brain processes information from the world, but we don't have computer simulations of the world, let alone brain simulations of the world. Choice E, totally not it. That leaves us with choice A, the one that sounded awesome to begin with, and it remains awesome and correct. So number 8, still on page 29. So the author of the passage would be most likely to agree with which of the following statements about the simulation of organ functions. So we don't get to the organ functions thing until second and third paragraph, where we talk about simulations of the stomach as an analogy to simulations of brain behavior. We also find out from the question stem itself that this is one of these the author of the passage would be most likely to agree with. This is another type of inference where we need to filter out from the passage what the author believes and then find something like that in the answer choices. So not something that's actually printed in the passage, just something that we can infer from the passage. Choice A, an artificial device that achieves the functions of the stomach could be considered a valid model of the stomach. Well, that's actually the entirely the basis of the third paragraph, that since the author suggests that Searle's objection to a computer model is that a computer stomach is not actually digesting food, the author then says, well, what if we make one that actually does digest food? So therefore, the author, him or herself, must believe that a mechanical stomach that's digesting food is a valid model of the stomach. That sounds really good. We're happy with that one. Let's take a look at the other ones, though. We want to make sure we get these right. You only get points on the GMAT for questions you actually get right, not for ones that you just got close on. Choice B, computer simulations of the brain are best used to crack the brain's codes of meaning and content. Wow. So this uses a lot of phrases that do appear in the passage. We do find out about cracking the code in, let's see, line 16, 17, 18. We do find out about computer simulations in the second paragraph. Meaning and content appear in the first paragraph. But this is just a jumble of things that don't actually represent what the passage is about. And so the author would definitely not agree with this. This is just a hodgepodge, a mixture of things that appear in the passage. Choice C, computer simulations of the brain challenge ideas that are fundamental to psychology and neuroscience. So this is actually the reverse of what the passage says. We find out in the first paragraph that the idea of the brain being similar to a computer is actually the basis and dominates neuroscience today. So this is completely the opposite. The author would definitely not agree with that, because the author agrees with that idea that the brain is basically an information processor. Choice D, because the brain and the stomach both act as processors, they can best be simulated by mechanical devices. Well, nobody is saying that in this passage, that it's best to simulate brains and stomachs and other organs by mechanical devices. The passage is about information processing. Also, the passage is definitely not about how best to simulate things. The whole idea is, or the whole argument is about how to think about how the brain thinks. So it's basically completely outside the scope of the passage, and therefore totally wrong. And then choice E, the computer's limitations in simulating digestion suggest equal limitations in computer simulated thinking. If anything, this is Searle's position that because the computer is not actually producing actual thoughts using the same mechanisms that a brain might, that limits its thinking. But that's actually not something that the author would agree with. The author thinks that because computers and brains are information processors, they both can produce thoughts. So the author would not agree with E, even though Searle may. That gives us choice A, the one that we thought was awesome to begin with. Okay, on to page 30. Page 30, question 9. It can be inferred that the author of the passage believes that Searle's argument is flawed by its failure to. Okay, so it mentions flat out in the question stem that this is an inference. So we know that whatever we're looking for isn't in the passage, but is implied by the passage. So Searle's argument is flawed because it fails to A, distinguish between syntactic and semantic operations. So this is actually the opposite of what we're after, because in fact Searle argues that Searle himself is the one who believes that computers cannot distinguish between syntactic and semantic operations. Syntax is the order that things are presented, putting this before that it's the arrangement of things, whereas semantics has to do with what things actually mean. So that's Searle's argument, that the brain can distinguish between these things, but a computer cannot. It's not something that the author believes is a flaw in Searle's argument. It cannot be choice A. That's from paragraph 1. So choice B, Searle's argument is flawed because it doesn't explain adequately how people, unlike computers, are able to understand meaning. So we actually do find out some information about that. Starting around in line 35, if one information processor were made to simulate another information processor, namely if a computer were made to simulate a brain, it is hard to see how one and not the other could be said to think. So the author's argument is that since they are similar, it would be strange. It doesn't explain how people actually can think then if they are not processing information the way a computer does. So that one's awesome. But we need to keep going. Choice C, does it not provide concrete examples illustrating its claims about thinking? So paragraph 3 does actually talk about concrete examples, this model stomach, but it's not actually a flaw in Searle's argument. In fact, Searle has a counter argument against the computer simulation version, at least. And so, concrete examples are not really at all something that we're talking about in terms of the objection to Searle's argument. Choice D, understand how computers use algorithms to process information. Oh, well, actually, it's Searle in paragraph 1 in line 6 to 7, if you go back and look. In line 6 to 7, it's Searle who says that computers only process information by algorithm where brains do it by some other means. So this clearly cannot be a flaw in Searle's argument. Choice E, decipher the code that is transmitted from neuron to neuron in the brain. We do talk about deciphering the code in the passage, but clearly this is not the flaw in Searle's argument. It's just that this is the author's basis for deciding that the brain is an information processor. So it must be choice B, that Searle does not explain how people can think if computers cannot. Question number 10, still on page 30. From the passage, it can be inferred that the author would agree with Searle on which of the following points. So here we need to find a point where they agree. So this will be very different. And again, we have to infer it because the author is primarily arguing against Searle. So, choice A, computers operate by following algorithms. Another one of those great moments where a previous question did a little bit of work for us. We found out that Searle admits that computers figure out things by algorithm, and then that's where they fall short of brains. The author, him or herself, thinks that brains are a lot more like computers than Searle does, so therefore the brain also uses algorithms. Very tempting. We should double check the others. Would they both agree that the human brain can never fully understand its own function? Well, we do actually find out from the in line 3 that Searle disagrees with this notion that that the brain is a information processor with fathomable rules. So Searle at least believes that the brain's rules are not fathomable, that fathomable means understandable. So while the author may think that we could actually crack the code someday, Searle does not. So it's not choice B. They don't agree. Choice C, do they agree that the comparison of the brain to a machine is overly simplistic? Well, the author basically makes that comparison repeatedly throughout the passage, so and Searle explicitly disagrees. They don't agree on that point. Do they agree that the most accurate models of physical processes are computer simulations? Well, nobody in the passage thinks this. But there's no evidence that they both disagree either. We just, well, Searle may. But in any case, it's not something they agree on based on the passage. And choice E, human thought and computer-simulated thought involve similar processes of representation. This is something the author absolutely does believe, but Searle absolutely does not. Again, Searle believes that the brain is something entirely different from a computer, or at least different enough. Leaves us with choice A. They agree that computers use algorithms. After that point, they totally disagree. All right, let's do one more question on this passage. The last one. Question 11. Which of the following most accurately represents Searle's criticism of the brain as computer metaphor, as that criticism is described in the passage? So choice A. Does Searle believe that the metaphor is not experimentally verifiable? Well, actually, the passage talks about how the brain is computer experiment. Both the author and Searle, or the author puts in Searle's mouth objections to the computer model, but not that it's not experimentally verifiable. In fact, Searle would perhaps argue that using a computer simulation of a brain is proof that the computer is not thinking. So the computer simulation is definitely not experimentally verifiable as far as the two of them are concerned, somewhat. So does Searle believe that the metaphor does not take into account the unique powers of the brain? So this sounds a lot like the sorts of things that Searle says. In fact, in lines 6 to 9, we have that computers cannot deal with important aspects of human thought such as meaning and content. So those are some unique powers of the brain, and then the lines after that have more. So this is certainly something that he thinks. But let's keep looking. is his criticism of the brain as computer metaphor that it suggests that a brain's functions can be simulated as easily as those of a stomach. So if anything, this is completely the opposite. The author may, well, even the author doesn't believe that it's as easy to simulate a brain as it is to simulate a stomach. So nobody believes this, least of all Searle, who thinks that the brain simply cannot be simulated. Choice D is his criticism that a computer can simulate the workings of the mind by using the codes of neural transmission. Well, Searle, we've already established, does not believe that computers can simulate the mind. So, we can pretty much eliminate that one totally. And choice E, that it's unhelpful because both the brain and the computer process information. Again, this is what the author believes, not what Searle believes, and so this would not be Searle's criticism of the brain as metaphor thing, because this would actually support his point, or weaken Searle's point, strengthen the author's point. That leaves us with choice B as the only viable option. I think this is as good a place as any to stop. Thanks once again for joining us for Grockit's OGTV GMAT edition, the 12th edition of the GMAT